I think for me, becoming a WGSS major was about pursuing what I was actually passionate about.
It was like for the first time, I was like mad in class, and I was just like so passionate about what I was learning. And for me, I've never had an experience like that in a classroom setting. Like,
I remember the day I left that class, we had finished misrepresentation, and like I walked outside onto the oval, and like the sun was shining, and I was like, I'm a feminist now. Like,
my passion really sits within women's studies because it gives me the tools to make that world that I really want.
The best thing that I've gained from being a major is I'm unafraid to call things out. I am most definitely always that person when something problematic happens. I look at someone straight in the eye and I'm like, that's not okay.
How to recognize when there's injustice and how to have the courage, because I know that it is an absolute necessity that we call it out. I've learned how to call out injustice.
people didn't feel the same way. People didn't want to hear it. It was uncomfortable for people to talk about, and I was talking about it all the time.
It's a lot of things that are relevant to my life. Like when I'm in class and when I'm talking about things, it's me.
I learned a lot about like what diversity really means and getting to the root of understanding other people and understanding their lives and where they've come from.
We see the world as we have all these boxes that people are supposed to fit into. And then women's studies allows us to see those boxes and how unrealistic that they are and the ways that we need to move beyond them and outside of them in order to really incorporate everyone.
In Mildred Monday's account of the establishment of the department, she has written that recalling the 1970s evokes both joy and incredulity. Only then could women's studies have been envisioned. The under 30 crowd were determined to change the face of the university and ultimately of the world. By 1970, a few scattered courses in various departments already contained references to feminism and to the dominance of patriarchy. The faculty teaching such courses worked alone until they gathered together for a one-day conference under the guise of the Division of Comparative Literature. The participation of panelists and audience resulted in the establishment of an informal, fluid group of faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students, including Verda Taylor, Leila Rupp, and Barbara Rigney, collectively self-designated as the Ad Hoc Committee of Women's Studies. The Ad Hoc Committee was self-selected and self-motivated, and the participants did not go public until a 30-page proposal outlining the desirability, viability, and structure of a Center for Women's Studies was completed. In 1975, Academic Affairs approved the establishment of an Office of Women's Studies that would work toward qualifying as a center. The Office of Women's Studies took up its challenge in February of 1975, headquartered in a one-roomed office with insufficient chairs for the gathering of staff to sit simultaneously for meetings. Until 1980, the Office of Women's Studies began circulating The Sojourner, a newsletter that offered academic, campus, community, and national information of interest to the issues that faced women at the time. The office began to focus on curriculum development and strengthen its grant-writing abilities. In 1980, the office was offering 3 courses, one section of Women's Studies 201, Introduction to Women's Studies in the Humanities, and one of Women's Studies 202, Introduction to Women's Studies in the Social Sciences, and later that year, a senior seminar. There were 2 majors and about 50 students, but what really got the dean's attention in those early years was that our enrollment seemed to quadruple every quarter. One year, there was a 600% increase. Throughout the 80s, the Office of Women's Studies developed its identity and overhauled its curriculum by attending NWSA conferences, including the historical Women Respond to Racism Conference in 1981, which broke open issues of racism within women's studies. By the end of the 1980s, with Susan Hartman as director, the number of women's studies faculty nearly doubled, with new faculty members specializing in women's health, African American women's literature and history, Latin American women, and women in economic development. As assistant director, Mary Margaret Fano contributed to the curriculum with courses on women and work and on women's movements. With increased public lectures and research grants to support women's studies research, the program built even more momentum and was able to establish a master's degree program. By 1990, 20 students were enrolled in the Master of Liberal Studies program concentrating in women's studies.
One of the first of its kind in the United States, OSU approved the Master of Arts in Women's Studies degree program in 1990. The center welcomed its first class of MA students in the fall of 1991. When Sally Kitch became director in 1992, the center was moved to its current location in University Hall. Under Kitch's directorship, the center finally earned its status as a department in 1995 after 3 years of negotiation, opposition, and political maneuvering.
Professor Bizgazinski asked me to share some memories of Ohio State in the early 1970s when, as far as I know, I was the first undergraduate to major in women's studies. Feminists of my generation sometimes lay it on a little thick, that today's women have it so much easier because of all the heavy lifting we did. That is only partly true. We did help pave the way, and we did make some things easier, but your generation is tackling issues that were frankly not even on our radar screen at the time, and we have so much to learn from all of you. Now let me set the stage for you for what it was like to be on campus in the early 1970s. For the country, this was a time of civil rights, of Vietnam protests, relatively easy access to drugs, and sexual liberation. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was a watershed moment. It was a heady time. But it took a little longer for some of this scene to travel from the East and the West coasts to Columbus. Now let me explain. During my freshman year, one of the big events on campus was the annual Women's Week. The grand finale at the end of the week, sponsored by the Women's Self-Government Association, was the bridal fair. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. An event to showcase wedding gowns and china, particularly to graduating seniors. Now, by the end of my 4 years, bridal fair was banished. It was replaced by rallies that featured bra burnings and marches to the State House in support of passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. We organized what we called at the time women's consciousness-raising groups. But I took a few women's studies courses, and these were relevant to me in a completely new and different way. Today, educators talk about something they call student-centered learning. Instead of emphasizing the teaching, the emphasis is on the learning. Those first women's studies classes were, for me, an explosion in student-centered learning. These were classes, whether in history, psychology, comparative literature, political science, that had me examining not only the content, the material, but doing so in the context of my own life as a woman, as a sister, as a daughter, and as a girlfriend. The opportunities for learning extended far beyond the classroom into what was happening in the world, on campus, and even in my own life. There was, of course, no women's studies department at the time, but Ohio State allowed me to create my own major by putting together in an interdisciplinary fashion all of these fabulous classes. I spent the next 3 years at the Yale Law School, where in my way, women's studies actually was a lifesaver, at least emotionally, and let me explain. Our class of about 100 students included about 25 women. Though we came from very diverse backgrounds, we all shared one thing in common, and that was the fear that we alone were the mistaken admission, and if we did not keep our heads down and our mouths shut, we would be discovered. Now, it's not that we were wimps. In fact, my class included Martha Minow, now Dean of the Harvard Law School, and also Sonia Sotomayor, now Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In the class right behind me was Anita Hill, who just a few years later would accuse nominee Supreme Court Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. But though we were not wimps, it was a very intimidating place. And what helped to keep me centered and focused was my earlier study of so many women who had been firsts in their own male-centered worlds with no role models and no family or institutional support, or worse, outright hostility. And the self-confidence, self-esteem, and frankly, ego that I developed and attributed in part to my own undergraduate studies. I had spent a lot of years advocating for changes in culture. I found it was a lot easier to do from a position of authority. The sense of empowerment that drew me to management was seeded during my years right here and nourished by my women's studies courses. Have we made progress since then? Yes. Have we more work to do? Absolutely. But I am retired now and loving it, so that the we I speak of is largely you and my daughters and granddaughters. But based on what I've seen on campus today, you are doing great work, stretching the concept of women's studies so far beyond what we imagined 40 years ago, and continuing to inspire the work and lives of women and men of this great institution. So to wrap up, what did women's studies do for me? Sure, it influenced my politics and my relationships. It also gave me a profound respect for the difference between gender equality based on law and based on culture, and why both matter.
Since its foundation in 1975, women's gender and sexuality studies has become one of the fastest growing fields of inquiry to emerge in higher education in the past 40 years. With the first full-time tenured faculty positions starting in the fall of 1997, our department as it stands today has grown significantly, with our award-winning, widely published faculty of 17 core members and more than 60 affiliated faculty across campus, in addition to 26 graduate students. During and following the chairships of Professor Valerie Lee from 1996 until 2001 and Linda Mijajewski from 2002 until 2007, the department has expanded its curricula and developed crucial funding and research opportunities. In 2001, the doctoral program was approved by the Board of Trustees, and in 2008, our first doctoral student, Dr. Min Suk Hyo, completed her dissertation. Since 2001, our PhD program has produced over 21 doctoral degrees, with scholars moving on to fulfill tenure track and director positions throughout the U.S. and globally. Over the years, our department has had the privilege of hosting trailblazing and noteworthy scholars such as Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, Gloria Steinem, Kathy Cohen, Anita Hill, and many others. Our department facilitates cutting-edge pedagogy workshops, seminars, and conferences every year, while our undergrads hold important demonstrations and rallies. In 2011, the department changed its name to the now Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies to reflect the variety of courses being offered and to be more representative of related fields of research across disciplines and amongst our core and affiliated faculty. Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at OSU makes vital contributions to the field through interdisciplinary research and innovative pedagogies, inspiring a new generation of gender and sexuality scholars and feminist leaders committed to social justice.
I think there are two really big things that I gained from being a WGSS major. The first is that I think I can empathize and love people better, because on a very academic level we learn about so many experiences, and we learn how to always be conscious of other experiences, but also I've learned how to take criticism. I think a really great thing about the WGSS department is that we really become a family in our classes, and so no one's afraid to be like, hey, you know what you said was really problematic, you should probably rethink that. And I think that kind of constructive criticism that comes from a place of love and empathy is something that I take with me, so I'm a person that can take critique better, and I can also love the people around me better.
I feel like my career in college has definitely been one that has molded me into a better just participant, I guess, in our society.
Like the way I identify is that I basically have all of the frameworks of privilege. Like I'm cisgendered, I'm able-bodied, white, male, like I have all those forms. But I feel like I should use that in order to help educate others in spaces that I'm allowed in automatically.
I started doing activism around stuff like reproductive justice and also transgender issues. And I think it's really helped me focus on what's causing inequality, and also I've learned a lot of things about differences between sex and gender.
Feminism is something that can help out anyone's cause, help anyone get out of an oppressive gender box, or help anyone to not have to have essentializing categories about their identities anymore. But honestly, I think the best thing that I've gotten from the major is how to be a better person.
It gives me like a framework to talk about things that I've been experiencing up until now, and I didn't know how to speak about or how to pay attention to, or what type of language I was supposed to use to say this is happening to me and that's not right. And WGSS kind of gives me those tools to address those things and know what's going on with me.
And being able to look at things from not just my white, heterosexual, middle-class perspective has been just such an incredible gift that I will be forever grateful for.